Well, good evening, everybody. Very warm welcome to the fifth of this year's Professorial Inaugural Lectures. I'm Jules Pretty, I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor. I'm just going to introduce Matthew with a few words first and then turn over to him. This is the part of the series of special events that we have to celebrate research excellence undertaken at the University of Essex by our recently appointed professors. The University of Essex is ranked 9th in the UK for the quality of our research, and we're proud to be undertaking and producing research that really matters for the world, and I think we'll hear a bit about that. It's also a great privilege to have leading global thinkers at the university, and this series of lectures throughout the course of the academic years covered sociology, law, will cover literature, government, and data, as we'll hear tonight. So, real pleasure to welcome Professor Matthew Woollard. Matthew is the director of both the UK Data Archive and the UK Data Service, and joined the UK Data Archive in January 2003 as the head of the History Data Service, after 6 years working in various research capacities in the History Department here. In 2006, he was appointed Associate Director and Head of Digital Preservation and Systems at the UK Data Archive, and then became Director in 2010. He completed his PhD in 2005 on the development of occupational classification in the British Isles for the period 1660 to 1911. And between 2004 and 2007, he headed a major JISC-funded digitisation project, Online Historical Population Reports, HistPop, which published online almost 190,000 pages of British historical population reports. And as we all know now, ancestor data is one area that's really captured the public imagination. You can get a sense of the size of the challenge with that big number, 190,000 pages. Matthew is Principal Investigator of the Enhancing and Enriching Historical Census Microdata Project and the UK Data Archive's lead on a European Commission project, Collaboration to Clarify the Cost of Curation. Matthew has acted as a consultant to historical digitisation projects and retains an interest in the analysis of historical sources for local and demographic history, as well as in the social construction of statistics from the past. Really important kind of translational issue there. He tells me he's had apologies from the librarian of the House of Commons, the British Library, the director of ICPSR, the US Big Brother sister to the UKDA. It's interesting how you used Big Brother in the narrative there with data. And also from the Director General of the Office for National Statistics. Sadly, they can't come, but we will have the video of tonight's lecture up in something like a month's time, so they'll have a chance to see that in person. Many other apologies as well. So we're very delighted that so many of you could make the lecture in person tonight. The title of the lecture is A Journey Through Data. Matthew will give his lecture, and then, as is now customary, we will repair to the fireside over here for a little chat and questions and answers from the audience, and then repair upstairs for drinks and a small celebration afterwards. So I'd like to ask you to join me to welcome Matthew Woollard, Professor Matthew Woollard, to give our lecture tonight. Thank you very much.
Deputy Vice-Chancellor, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Jules, for that fine introduction. Part of my title could have given away a little bit about what I was going to talk about, and almost everything that Jules has said, you're probably going to hear again, but in a little bit more detail. Because whenever anyone looks back over their career so far, there's often a feeling about a certain inevitability about what one's done, and that it fits into something like a teleological approach. But for most people who don't follow a standard career path in higher education, I think this is rubbish. You take chances, you take opportunities, and you end up, hopefully, enjoying the things that you end up doing. I've been extraordinarily lucky. I haven't been out of work since I completed my MA, and honestly, I've never worked on anything out of which I haven't derived at least some pleasure from. So, indulge me in offering an overview of how parts of my career join up, and at least to me, provide a semi-coherent research profile it's unashamedly personal, and it's a journey touched by data at every point. So first, here's an extract from my CV. It shows in pretty bland terms what I've done. And while I've worked in an academic environment for more than 20 years, I don't have an academic contract. I've done very little teaching, as little as I could possibly get away with, and frankly, the traditional research, which I've done in the last few years, wouldn't fill a small book. And what this bland list of jobs doesn't show is that I've been directly or indirectly responsible for over £25 million worth of research funding, and I'm the principal investigator on various projects. Unfortunately, there are a few more to administer than Jules mentioned. It means that I and the senior staff at the UK Data Archive are currently responsible for research funding right now for more than 70 members of staff, and that's probably going to go up in the future. I don't work alone. Every member of the Data Archive plays a role in the success of the archive. As my contract is non-academic, my professorship is non-traditional. I'm not sure that Professor Geoffrey Alderman would wholly approve, but I think he should. It's been awarded on the basis of my contribution to the university and my contribution to data services and to digital preservation. It's recognition that data services and digital preservation are part of the academy, and that the UK Data Archive is a valued part of the university. My philosophy as director of the Data Archive is guided by my career to date, and by discussing some of the key points in my career, I think I can show that data services and digital preservation are cross-disciplinary subjects, and that there is a demonstrable need to build up and develop skills in this profession. So, rewind. I did a rather traditional history degree at Goldsmiths College, and one of the special features of this course was that on a Thursday afternoon, lecturers gave an optional class on themes, or whatever took their fancy. Attending one of those started me on this data-related journey. David Dean, now a professor at Carleton University, then a junior lecturer, gave us 45 minutes on the topic of history and computing. And for further reading, he held up a couple of books, and if you know them, you'll know that they were pink and light blue, 2 collections of papers from recently held conferences. Remembering, of course, that that's what a PC looked like then. And when he returned those books to the library, I took them out. Nobody else in the class was interested. I skimmed them. I was hooked. History and computing was getting into my blood. And I learned later, in the following year, that some of the co-editors of those volumes were setting up an MA, rather unwieldily titled Computer Applications in Historical Research, and it was to be taught at the Institute for Historical Research at the University of London. I'm pretty certain, but I can't remember, that it was the ESRC who were providing studentships for this course, and I applied and I got one, and it was a tremendous course. And I can't thank those lecturers enough. I can't thank those lecturers and their impressive guests enough, because without them I probably wouldn't be here. The course provided me with a very broad introduction to themes that still resonate today, and in truth, skills that have stood me in good stead for more than 20 years. And that course provided me with an entree into the research world that I've been involved with ever since. My MA dissertation was entitled something like Project Management and the 1881 Census. I can't find it. And it was a subject which was pushed to me by Charles Harvey and John Press. And Charlie's now a PVC at Newcastle, and John Press runs the fantastic JP Guitars in Bristol. And they, and the Genealogical Society of Utah, got me interested in project management techniques. The complex and rigorous procedures they devised to ensure that many hundreds of volunteers transcribed and made machine-readable the British population censuses for 1881 in a consistent and harmonious approach have remained with me. Which all goes to show that transferable skills are important for MA students. A highly condensed version of my dissertation was eventually published in this book on databases and historical research. After the MA, I immediately got a job with Peter Denley and Manfred Thaler at Queen Mary in Westfield, teaching a source-oriented data processing package. Peter was a huge influence. Not only did he pioneer historical computing in the UK, he provided me with a moral standpoint and a work ethic which has served me well. I think I follow in his footsteps by publishing sparsely but wisely. It's worth mentioning that source-oriented data processing was then a reaction against the social science approach to computer-based history. The mantra in historical computing was keep as close to the original as possible. It emphasized the necessity of not pre-coding, not altering data, and being transparent in coding decisions. You never know when you've made a mistake, or more importantly, interpreted something differently from how someone else might. Lay out all your workings for someone to see. Peter and I wrote this tutorial for the software Clio, and I later edited a collection of research pieces which used this software. My contribution was to delve into the methodology of record linkage by attempting to semi-automate the process of linking the lists of names in two 18th century commercial directories. My key contribution to this methodology was to argue to exclude from linkage any keys, any variables which are going to be used in analysis. So if you happen to be interested in the geographic mobility of traders in 18th century Bristol, you wouldn't use the address of a person to join records. In a standard record linkage procedure, these two entries from two different commercial directories in Bristol in the 1790s might be considered to be different people because they have a different address, but in fact they do refer to the same person. So from Queen Mary and Westfield, I took a job at the University of the West of England for a project called the Bristol Historical Databases Project with Peter Wardley. And amongst the work we undertook in the project was an attempt to recover the Social Survey of Bristol from 1937. This was one of the last pre-war poverty surveys, following on in methodology from the surveys of Rowntree, Bowley, Llewellyn-Smith and Caradog-Jones. It was also, almost certainly, the first use of a tabulating machine for processing survey data outside of the Census Office. The survey was taken between May and December 1937, and some 4,500 households were surveyed. Preliminary analysis was carried out at the time, but the war intervened and work stopped. And what remained from the survey by the 1990s was negligible. This pamphlet with preliminary results, a scrapbook of press cuttings, and a series of printouts. And this is what the printouts looked like. Each of the variables are shown down in columns, and there's a list of questions in the pamphlet, and we thought it would be a really easy task to try and match the questions to the responses that are given here. But it wasn't, because the rules used for punching the cards made it impossible to fully decode the data. So some of the columns on the punch cards had been punched with a 0 with a special significance, and other columns had several characteristics included, and some were double punched. And these printouts only covered half the data on each card. We learned, as others had before us, that the format of the punched card had forced decisiveness in coding decisions on the original researchers. And the legacy was partial incomprehensibility. In our write-up of the project, Peter and I suggested that this was an exemplary justification for the universal post-coding of historical data. And we should have mentioned that this held for the social sciences too. Pre-coding is not necessary, as data can always be input, though at a cost, in its original format and post-coded for analysis. Obviously, in 1937, pre-coding, which, to those who don't know, is the allocation of a numerical string, was the only way to translate the information captured on the questionnaires into an analysable form. Today, post-coding, that's coding at the stage of analysis, presumes the maintenance of the raw data, allowing others how to decide to code or adapt the codes that you choose. In 1937, the punch card forced possible compromises on researchers. Software still has a tendency to make researchers make compromises today. And just for amusement, here's a punch card used in the 1900 census of Norway, showing an ingenious attempt by Norwegian statisticians to use the whole of a punch card in a pretty non-standard way. And the illustrations, you can probably just see a little fisherman with binoculars tucked in there. The illustrations there were to help the punching staff in their job. So as Jules said, I came to Essex in 1996 after Kevin Schurer, Sheila Anderson and Humphrey Southall got a Leverhulme Trust Award to prepare the first complete machine-readable census, historical census for academic use. There had been plenty of crossover social science history work on censuses in the USA, but not a lot in the UK. And it wasn't quite over the toss of a coin, but Mark Allen and I, as two research assistants, we split the coding work that needed to be done. He got geography, and I got occupations. And if I hadn't got the occupations, I probably wouldn't be here today. On the face of it, what I had to do was quite simple. Take a file covering the population of one county, strip off the occupational information, and apply a code to each of the occupational strings, which matched the code which would most likely have been given to that occupation by the clerks who worked in the census office in 1881. And when I'd completed a county, I'd extract the occupational information from the next county, merge the two files together, and then start coding again. So here's some raw data. The original strings in the middle, the frequencies in 1881 in the blue column, and the code on the far left. And what should be really clear from this is that groom, there's a picture of one, was a rather ambiguous job title, or at least it was to the statisticians in 1881. People returning the occupation groom would either be classified as domestic servants, code 54, or as not domestic servants, code 114. And my job was really to allocate the correct code to more than 1 million of these strings. But thankfully there was a code book, essentially a code book used by the census clerks at the time, showing grooms with their original code here of 53, not 54. But if you can read it, there is also another groom tucked in here, the groom of the chamber, perhaps less euphemistically, the groom of the stool, who would have been classified among domestic indoor servants. So appropriate classification depends on context in so many cases. And in the case of the 1881 census, with this colour illustration, you can see that one of the clerks carrying out the analysis made it clear that this cook, and there's a cook just below the white gap in the middle there, was to be classified with non-domestic cooks, since he was working in an inn, and this is an inn in Colchester. And if the transcribers of this source hadn't added the ND, it would have been much harder to code correctly. In the work which I had to do, coding was also undertaken in an isolationist manner. Only the codes themselves were viewed, and not other information like sex or relationship to head of household, or occupation of the head of household, or disability or geography. So it meant that these codes still represent a rough cut. But after 6 years, various contracts, this work was complete. And we deposited the fruits of our labours at the Data Archive, like good ESRC-funded people that we were at the time, and in a slightly different form at the Minnesota Population Center. The outcome was a huge data set, and there was a cut-down sample for those without the processing power to manage all of it at the time, which had been fully coded and enhanced. Some key differences to social science data sets were, and I think still are, that all of the original strings have been retained, and where information has been changed, it's clearly flagged, so others can reject the carefully considered opinions of Kevin and I if they didn't like them. So we may have changed someone's sex, so to speak. If an individual was recorded as a male but had a female name, and a female relationship, we'd changed the sex to female. But we flagged it, so anyone could see that we'd changed it, and we described the rules we used. A non-ref submittable output of the project was a little booklet listing a few hundred silly occupations we found in the transcriptions. It wasn't always clear whether these were transcription errors or just funnies in the schedules, but the booklet seems to have had some impact in the Office for National Statistics, because just before the 2011 census, this poster was published, and it includes a list of curious occupational titles, which I'm not really absolutely sure, since I went back to look at the raw data the other day, I'm not sure whether these really are all correct occupations given by people in a single household. Anyway, there was a more permanent output from the project, this longer booklet, which we published internally. And in it, I wrote that classifying occupational titles into groups of similar occupational titles increases their usability without losing too much of their original meaning. Occupational titles, like other nouns, are ultimately only linguistic codes representing our collective understanding of a concept. And by extension, occupational titles in themselves are classificatory. This makes complete sense when you think about it, but it wasn't really clear whether this had really been articulated by a social scientist quite in this way before. As Kevin moved to the data archive, so I followed him. A vacancy had occurred in the History Data Service. I applied, was interviewed, got the post, and one of the very first things I had to do on taking up the post was to bring in hand an opportunity which had been taken by my predecessor, Cressida Chapel. Cressida had ensured that population statistics were on a list of important stuff that could be digitised, and the JISC had considerable funding to organise a digitisation programme. Historical population statistics didn't top the popularity poll that they carried out, but they carried it out over the Christmas vacation of 2002, and a little bit of lobbying got it high enough up the poll to make the grade. And I got pushed into it. I had to produce a detailed project plan which was fully costed in a very short time, and the finances had to be agreed with JISC. And the first cut was for nearly £1 million, and it was by far and away the biggest grant that I had received. The HISPOP website was the result of this project, and as Jules said, it contains digitised versions of almost all the published census reports across the British Isles down to 1931. All the annual reports of the Registrar Generals, a large quantity of illustrative material. You've just seen a scan from the Enumerator's book from 1881 from the website, and a large number of contextual essays by Eddie Higgs and me. It still functions, it doesn't look too out of date, still gets thousands of users a month, and I still have to answer a query or so every week from the site. It was an expensive project, but this was still pioneering times for mass digitisation. The overall programme was beautifully coordinated, and lessons learned from across the programme are now, I think, standard practice in the digitisation world. But two of the lessons we learned about the importance of metadata and of quality control sometimes seem not to have been taken up elsewhere with such rigour. And I don't think that any of the digitisation at scale projects that have followed us have allowed users to search for Roman numbered pages. So while it was expensive, it was designed to be sustainable. And essentially since 2006, it's had relatively little maintenance. After 10 years, we'll need to take a good look under the bonnet. The History Data Service was another matter. All of its holdings have been integrated into the data archive, and some of them remain among the more popular collections we hold. Digital humanities has still massive potential, and now, even more than ever, scholars within the humanities need to add to their skill sets. Scholars within information science and computing science need to add to their skill sets too. So while all this was going on, between 1999 and 2005, I had the privilege of working on a PhD My first supervisor was Jeff Crossick, second was Eddie Higgs, and the title of the thesis was Conceptions of Work, Occupational Classification in the British Isles from 1660 to 1911. It built very strongly on the work I'd done as a research assistant, and research provided a happy interlude on the coding and increasingly managerial work which I was doing as a day job. Kevin was my boss over the period, and he spurred me on and indulged my research schedule. One of the key conclusions from the PhD was that the changing nature of classificatory systems informs historians about alterations within both society and the economy, as well as in the intellectual developments, which in turn affect the way in which historians understand the past. And I suspect if I was writing it now, I'd start to use the word social scientists in there with historians as well. For future historians to understand not just how classifications are constructed, but why they are constructed is key. Quite why the occupational classification scheme used in the Indian census of 1881 was almost the same as in England in the same year is probably unknowable, but it's also clear that in that census an improbable socio-economic structure was imposed on the statistics, if not upon the nation. One of the chapters also looked at the question of how census statisticians interpreted multiple occupations, and I spun this out into a fuller article in the journal Local Population Studies, examining the incidence and potential effects on the published statistics of this rather overt source of occupational diversity. Each of the three occupations carried out by William Woodward, that's carman, nightman, carman and chimney sweeper, would have been in the 19th century classified to three separate occupational groups. And this form of occupational diversity has the possibility to seriously affect some of the groupings of occupations in the 1881 census. So almost 30, some categories of occupations you could inflate by up to 30% if you didn't use the first listed occupation given by individuals. It was at about this stage in my career that I knew I had to drop some of the historical research. I wasn't productive enough, and a new role in the data archive, the head of digital preservation and systems, was being developed. One of the last substantial pieces of historical research that I did carry out, however, was in collaboration with Peter Rozelle and Christine Spence. And this was an evaluation of a digital transcription of English parochial registers in Bedfordshire, ESRC funded, of course. And this was a detailed examination triangulating multiple records relating to death registration in Bedfordshire, and the records were parish registers, probate inventories, and the statistics published in the early 19th century censuses. We discovered much more under registration than could simply be explained by traffic in corpses, that's migration after death, and discovered some very clear differences between occupational groups. And I think it's only with large-scale studies like this, with a unified methodology, that we will continue to advance our understanding of England's population history in the past. The research project was really a sidebar to the increasingly managerial and data curation work I was doing in the data archive. The highlights of working as the head of digital preservation and systems was to push through a more standards-based approach to the curation activities the archive carried out. And this led to a complete reformulation of the archive's digital preservation policy, possibly still the most referenced policy of its type. And it's slightly related, but the illustration is of a much later book, published last year in fact, which includes a co-authored article with Raivo Rusalep, Bram van der Werf and Cal Lee on standards alignment in digital preservation. And I mention this because the book, not the contribution, but the book won last year's Society of American Archivists Preservation Publication Award. It could have been even more narrowly defined perhaps as their Digital Preservation Publication Award, but it was a great honour to be involved in this award. I also steered the data archive through its first certification against ISO 27001, an information security standard giving us the ability to run the secure data service. And I was involved in the first major review of the key standard, which now informs the basic practices of all important repositories which curate digital materials. And this representation of the workflow of the UK Data Archive was created around this time to ensure consistency of approach across the organisation. And I know there are plenty of people in here from the Data Archive, and I know you all hate this diagram, and you think it's much too small to be read, but I'm still really proud of this, because it shows the whole of what almost all of those 70 people do in a single diagram, and it works from left to right. So thank you, Hervé, for helping me with this. The 3 years I spent in that post were an unofficial apprenticeship to the post which I now hold. But before I move to that, I want to make some remarks about digital preservation, as it's part of the core of the work of the UK Data Archive. In essence, what the archive does, and has done for a long time, is to take social science data from its creators, look after it, and make it available to users. And unlike in a traditional archive, we have to modify the files we're given in order to ensure that they're going to be able to be used in the future. My key argument is that the primary purpose of the activity of digital preservation is to ensure that the materials are being preserved can be used at some defined point in the future. Future use is not the same as future presence. It's easy to ensure that a digital file is present sometime in the future, but it's not easy to ensure that the digital file is usable. Ensuring the long-term access of anything involves asking a series of questions relating to the value of that thing. To whom is their value, both now and at different times in the future? And can the resources which are required to maintain that value over time be justified in terms of the cumulative value provided by that as an asset? It's a moot point whether or not the cost of looking after the original punched cards from the Bristol Social Survey would have been equal or less than the value to which historians might ascribe to them now. Therefore, despite being a digital archivist, I want to try and ensure that the creators of digital assets, especially those within the social sciences and humanities, need to make some of their own decisions about the value and importance of the material which they create, and to ensure that the legacy, including the value, of what they have created is maintained over time. In chapter 5 of his seminal From Memory to Written Record, the medievalist Michael Clanchy discusses the development of the concept of records, I'm emphasizing records, from a monastic and a secular point of view. He remarks that owing to the media available to the scribes in the Middle Ages, which were wax tablet or parchment, scribes made conscious choices between an ephemeral document or a permanent record. This is a permanent record. Today, when digital media proliferates, it's mainly used because it provides the most effective transmission of a work, and that distinction has, at first glance, disappeared. Documents and records are now both digital, and the stubborn questions which remain are what should be looked after for posterity, and why should they be looked after for posterity? Within the digital realm, these are hard questions because the costs of preserving digital materials are much more expensive than their analogue counterparts, and because they are, ab initio, more liable to disappear or become unusable. The effort required to read a 100-year-old letter that has not been actively curated is considerably less than the effort to read a 30-year-old locoscript file. However, it's not impossible. Most born digital material is, if it exists and you throw enough time and effort into it, recoverable. However, the chances of born digital materials being usable in 100 years is considerably improved by performing actions on that material soon after or even during creation. So the actions performed by the medieval scribes to choose both an effective medium for information transmission and a sensible format denoting the value of the material to posterity can be considered analogous to the current situation. effective digital preservation relies to some extent on the activities of the creator as well as the archivist. Those who create need to make decisions, just as the scribes did, about the value and importance of the material they create. And this is why, in my mind, research data management is so crucial to both research and data curation. And one of the reasons I've been involved in this book, which is going to be published by Sage in the next month or two. And it will be worth every penny of the $24.95 it will cost you, and it's available from all good online booksellers now. But back to the past. I took over as director of the Data Archive when Kevin went to Leicester in October 2010. The organisation was in fantastic shape when he left, and in some respects I've just taken hold of the reins. In another respect, one of the main services which the Data Archive runs on behalf of the ESRC undertook a fundamental change, which necessitated a complete restructuring of the organisation and the way in which it functioned. So plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Now my work is mostly about KPIs, financial planning, dealing with HR, space management, other management issues, having meetings. It's all a lot less interesting than some of the historical research I've been used to, but it's better paid. However, every day, pretty much every day, in one way or another, I draw on my experiences in historical computing. And seriously though, I believe strongly, I won't say passionate because that's become a cliche, that managing is a privilege, and that all members of staff within the Data Archive should have the opportunity of providing a valued service to enhance the research of others and even to carry out their own research, especially if it's not recognised in the new order for higher education. I firmly believe that managers and directors in centres like the Archive must have an understanding of some of the coalface work that they carry out. So the UK Data Service, the collaborative service which the SRC funds, is the major but not the only thing which is done at the Data Archive. We use our strategic plan in alignment with the university's overall strategy and research strategies to develop services and data infrastructure that benefit social science researchers and other stakeholders. The UK Data Archive now hosts the Administrative Data Service, and we're possibly on the brink of another award which will keep me away from historical research of any sort for a few years, but it will keep me in the world of big data. So I'm going to end by discussing a few features of my most recent research project. Again, combines the census and digital curation strands of my career so far. It's also the one which is slightly mysteriously hinted on your invitation card. This is a project to enhance and enrich more censuses, and in this project is the British censuses of 1961 through to 1981. And before I discuss this in any detail, I want to make it absolutely explicit that I'm talking about the digital versions of these censuses and not the original paper forms. The paper forms or schedules do survive, and they're maintained properly by their owners. The project has its origins with the dedication and interest of Bob McKay at the Minnesota Population Center. Bob has been collecting, preserving, and making usable vast quantities of what historians call contemporary census data. He'd go someplace, and he pretty much went from Argentina to Vietnam and everywhere in between, and asked the census office whether or not he could take the digital data back to the USA and, after appropriate anonymization, make it available for research use. And one major developed country almost always evaded Bob's hard work, and that was the UK. In 2010, a group of official statisticians, funders, and other interested parties, included me, finally came together and came to an agreement to prepare the digital files from these historical censuses for preservation and reuse. The ESRC, again, chose to fund this project liberally, and while the project is running perhaps a little behind schedule, it should be completed early this year. The Office for National Statistics, the National Records of Scotland, and the Northern Ireland Statistics and Research Agency will have preservation copies of these censuses, and the academic world will have high-quality, enhanced samples of those data for their use, and a public version will be constructed for teaching purposes. The whole process has been made a lot harder by the fact that the digital versions of most of these censuses have not been looked after quite as well as they could be. And while the paper forms for these censuses exist, it's now clear that the digital copies are incomplete. This hasn't stopped the project from getting very close to creating preservation versions of these de-identified census data, and it hasn't stopped us from creating, well, at least at the time of speaking, specifying a suite of sample of anonymized records for academic and public use. It's been extraordinarily helpful that a lot, but unfortunately not all, of the relevant documentation from these censuses is available at the National Archives. And this letter explains how the English and Welsh Census Office collaborated with their Scottish counterparts to ensure no overlap in the codes to the same questions about migration. Now, I wanted to end by bringing together a number of strands of research interest, including some preliminary results of a completely new analysis of the 1981 census data, but for various reasons that's not been possible. So I'm going to show you something to leave you to think about from the 1881 census. Demographers have always been interested in age heaping in surveys and censuses. Measures of age heaping give an indication of the level of incorrectly reported ages in a census. And since ages are used to calculate mortality, an indication in the level of error in the reporting of ages can inform inaccuracies in the construction of life tables. Historians have also become more interested in age heaping recently, and it's believed that age heaping can provide a partial proxy for the level of numeracy, education, and even economic development. So this table shows, using both published and unpublished data, the extent of age heaping in various censuses. So what this table is reporting is something called Myers Blended Index for each relevant year. And the index shows the approximate, got to be very careful with words, it's the approximate low-bound percentage of cases of age being misreported across all single years of age. So in the census of Ireland, where individual years of age were collected, unlike in rest of Great Britain or in Great Britain, at least 34% of people's ages were reported incorrectly. And you can see that there's a considerable change in England and Wales over time, and it's even more pronounced in both Scotland and Ireland with the figures that we've got. So going back to 1881, there's also a pretty clear pattern, a pretty clear geographical pattern amongst the misreporting of ages. So this is men, and you can see there's a light band down the middle, and as you move towards the periphery, age heaping becomes worse. And that's for men, this is for women. They use slightly different scales. I said earlier about being messed around, researchers being messed around with by their software. I can't get the same groupings on this piece of free software. Why should I? But for women, it looks worse, but it's actually not much. It's in fact slightly better than for men. So it gives the lie to the cartoonists and the superintendent of statistics who said that women were much more likely to lie about their ages. Well, this is evidence that that's not the case in 1881. And the underlying data for these two maps uses everybody. But for those of you who haven't studied the census, or for those of you who have studied the census, either for genealogical reasons or more academic research, or even filled one in, will know that schedules are delivered to households, and usually one member of each household completes it. Most analyses of the census microdata seem to assume that each record has equal, in inverted commas, accuracy. And I believe that since most of the data in historical censuses are filled in by others than to whom the record refers, that this isn't the case. So here's the third map, which shows the same index for female domestic servants in 1881. It only covers those people who are reported as a servant in their relationship to head of household. And their occupation can be classified as a domestic servant. There are 5 counties excluded from this analysis, but look at the scale. The low category here is more than twice the low category, is more than double the low categories in the previous maps. And the high category, again, represents almost a third of the people under observation. And the distribution of low to high, as shown in the map, is much more muddled than by the maps we've just seen. And I've heightened this with the colours on this map on purpose, but it does show that there is much less of a clear geographical pattern amongst these female domestic servants. Now, I don't know whether this is an effect of the distribution of domestic servants. I don't know whether it can be explained by the different relations between master and servant in different parts of the country. I don't know whether heads of household in the southeast and Devon and Lancashire and around Gloucestershire have a better knowledge of their servants' ages. I don't know whether servants might be involved more in the census process in these counties. I don't have an answer. But the data suggests that further research is required. And it again reminds us that the context around the collection of any data requires further thought. The ages reported overall in 1881 were robust enough to calculate mortality rates, but they're clearly not robust enough to calculate the same rates for this specific occupational category. And this occupational category accounted for more than 1 in 20 women in the country. So I'm waiting for the 1981 census data to try and test this theory. Are people who are not likely to be filling in the form just or at least proportionally more likely to have their age reported incorrectly? So my time is up. First series of bullet points and last series of bullet points. Context. When you read in newspapers or a peer-reviewed article, stop and consider the provenance of the data, work back to the processes which collected the information in the first place. Second, classification are constructs. Treat them as such. Data management and curation. If you create data, look after it. Ensure that what you want to be usable in the future is looked after, because it's my best guess that in the future specialist digital repositories like the Data Archive will become increasingly specialist, looking at massive or personal or sensitive or complex data. And lastly, skills. The Data Archive and other cognate organisations need people with an ever-broadening range of skills, and we in the Academy must all play a role in ensuring that good research is backed up with high-quality data. So that's me finished. This is a list of all the sources for the illustrations, and then we're back to the beginning.